Thank you for coming down. I'm going to start right away because I think I have a bit of material to go through. So I just want you to say hi to my son. His name is Henri Hypertext. So glad that he came along. Anyhow, I like to greet everyone, or at least I like to greet the Dom, usually in the morning. I usually say good morning, Dom, but I'm just going to say good afternoon, Dom, because nothing happens without the Dom. So I'd need to greet her. And I got to say, I'm glad to be back in Raleigh, North Carolina. I haven't been here in quite a few years, actually. Or what we used to call US East 1B, for those who are more familiar with that terminology. Yeah. Raleigh, birthplace of Clay Aiken. I didn't know that. You know, I guess North Carolina hero. He doesn't have fans here. That's cool. North Carolina, birthplace of Nina Simone. Shout out to Nina for the music fans. Okay, thank you. Like she's related to me. North Carolina, home of Anna Cockrell, silver medalist in the 400-meter hurdles this year in Paris. Fine as hell. Just have to add that. North Carolina, home now of Caitlin Toohey, distance running goddess. Go Pack. She went to NC State. There we go. Anyhow, let's get going. So I like to celebrate birthdays personally. I think they're great. And do you know that today was a significant birthday? Well, I guess so, in the web, because HTML5 was officially sort of launched today 10 years ago. I thought that was kind of cool. And I find that kind of like a significant moment in history because, honestly, it gave us some of the capabilities that we needed to kind of move on in the web. And like I said, 10 years ago today, that's when that was announced. And personally, I thought it was significant because some of you may recognize this logo. Oh, apparently a bunch of you do. But I say this because when HTML5 was introduced, many believed this was the beginning of the end for Flash, and we all know it because, again, some of you fans will remember this quote. Rather than use Flash, Apple has adopted HTML5, CSS, JavaScript, all open standards. That was Steve Jobs. That was in the famous Thoughts on Flash letter, for those who read that when it first released. But the most important part here is that he mentioned that it was HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript. Again, all open standards. And I felt like this was them doubling down on the platform, knowing that things were going to get a lot better. And Thoughts on Flash was released April in 2010. And the iPhone had been out 3 years. Let me see. React was about to launch a few years from then. Probably, I think it was 2013, React. Anyhow, what I'm trying to say is that, the web apps specifically were becoming much more capable. Because if you think about it, Thoughts on Flash and what Steve Jobs had said was really centered around the mobile device that they had launched, which was the iPhone. And a lot of things were starting to happen. Even though we were at the beginning of e-commerce, but I always remember this period around 2010, 2012, 2014, all the things that were capable online. And I took the slide out, but I still remembered. I remember it was 2 a.m. one day, and I was walking home, and I had to buy a ticket to go see my old roomie in the UK. She was getting married. And I just found it phenomenal that I was able to buy it at 2 a.m. on my iPhone, And to me, that was just a statement of things to come. So we're going to talk about a lot of things today. And I want to welcome everyone to a talk that I'm calling a web performance story, using open source data sets to make informed deployment decisions around performance and user experience. Now, quickly, you can find me on socials pretty much everywhere at Henri Helvetica. I got this little situation called Command H, little startup. I can get into it a little later. You can come see me about it. DevComs, developer communications, developer community, big fan of both. I'm from the greatest city on the planet called Toronto, in Canada. Any Canadians here? I didn't think so. And I'm a bit of a distance runner, so I share some of my running stories using hashtag #devswhorun. I'm actually injured right now, so you will not see anything from me. That being said, I just want to get into it because I love data. I love talking about data. I love looking it up. I hang out with others who also love data. I'll give you a quick example. One day, a good friend of mine, Paul Calvano, we were talking about, we had seen something online. We were talking about all the different ways that people were writing JPEG online. And these were some of the findings, which were kind of bizarre. I don't know how you would sort of load a site up and, anyhow. But I love performance data. I love talking about performance. And ultimately, performance data is really user experience data. So I love that as well. Now, earlier, I talked about like how April, 2010, things were really starting to move, right? Steve Jobs was really prioritizing the mobile devices like things are going to move this way. Now, I like to reference fall 2016 quite often. Why? Well, it was a significant moment in history of the web, specifically mobile web. Why do I say that? Well, this is the first time in fall of 2016 that the web was being accessed more on mobile devices than desktop. It's kind of like one of those 50% plus ones. But that is when things really start to change. And, keeping that in mind that mobile was starting to be used more often than desktop, us in the performance community, this was also significant because we know that mobile devices, especially back then, were not anywhere near as powerful as desktops. So when it comes to dealing with performance issues and just user experience in general, we keep this kind of information in mind. So we'll predominantly do some testing on mobile first. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to use this. Anyone ever heard of the HP archive? Amazing. For those that haven't, we're going to have some fun. So I'm going to pull some data from the HP archive, and it's a kind of like a data set of, again, right here, it says how the web is built. We can deep dive in somebody, because it's crawled by this tool called Web Page Test. I'll get into that a little later. But we can see how the web is built. We can see what people are putting on the web, how they're using it. And like I said, that earlier example with all the JPEG, the ways people are spelling JPEG, we were able to pull it from there. So we're going to we're going to talk about the HP archive, and specifically, we're going to also talk about the Web Almanac. It's a kind of like a document that was being released about every year since 2020, I believe, where we do even deeper dives, and we really look at how people are deploying online and what kind of what their habits are about, or specifically dissection of performance, patterns, configurations in detailed across the web. So I'm going to rifle through a bunch of examples to let you know what we tend to look at, and it'll sort of like, lead to the bigger story. So things like CSS compression, right? So once upon a time, Colt McCannis, engineer at Google, had mentioned, nothing happens on the internet without compression, which I completely believe, by the way. So we had noticed in the sort of the research that 27% of CSS was being compressed using Brightly. Amazing for those who understand. 59% were using gzip. Still great because it's still being compressed, but we rather see more people use broadly. But 14% were not being compressed with broadly or gzip whatsoever. So these are the things that we'll pull and we'll let people know, like, hey, make sure that you check because, broadly is great, gzip is great as well. Not having any compression could be seen as poor. And these are just random examples that I'm pulling, but I just want to get you to see like what is possible when you start to do the research. Image formats loaded by CSS, since we're on the CSS tip. So in 2021, as you know, you can load some images through some CSS. In 2021, we're seeing that 44% of the formats, the images were in PNG formats, PNG. 16% JPEG, which is quite small actually. 4% WebP, 17% SVG, and 18% GIF. And we saw the progress in 2022, how things change. A lot less PNGs, PNGs, more SVGs, more JPEGs, unfortunately more GIFs as well, but a lot more WebPs. Now, you might look at this and be like, okay, cool, they're images, what does that mean? Well, just remember that the PNG, the PNG, and the GIF are lossless images, so they're probably going to be larger than they need to be. The SVG, also great format because it's text-based, it's going to compress well. JPEG, obviously great. The WebP, an emerging, at the time, kind of like an emerging newer format, but the fact that we're seeing more of it is also good news. But this also indicates to us that, you know what, the fact that, well, I'll get into it a little later because we're going to talk about the LCP, but this can be potentially problematic, but these are the stories and the data that we pull down so that when we do some auditing, some investigations, this may come back. Who here is familiar with Core Web Vitals? It's probably like teams talk about it all the time. If they don't, they probably should at some point. Let's look at what we call good Core Web Vitals. So the Core Web Vitals, 3 indicators of vitals on a page on the web. There's LCP, now there's IMP, and there's also this thing called CLS. But to have good Core Web Vitals tends to indicate that your site is probably doing all right on the performance side. Not always, but you're on the right path. So in 2020, we saw that on desktop, 34% of sites had decent Core Web Vitals. And then on mobile, 24%. And we saw what's happening, we saw what happened in 2021 and 2022. Some improvements, but you could tell that the mobile device will almost always trail the desktop. This is data that we also keep in mind and we like to see because it informs you on what's going on with your site potentially. And again, this is kind of like all random data, but I really want to pull some of it to give you an idea of what we see. So let's look at good LCP in 2021. All right, so what is good LCP? Now, largest contentful paint is seen as a good indicator because it's the first bit of content a user tends to see, right? So if you have poor LCP, chances are things may not go well for the rest of your page load. So on desktop, which is usually pretty good, good at 61%. So what does that mean? Your largest piece of content was loading in 2.5 seconds or faster. We can see at 27%, I put meh. Well, that means it's loading at beyond 2.5 seconds, but under 4 seconds. And poor, 4 seconds or more, at 12% on desktop. You'll also see that mobile is almost always less off. And here we see a good rating at 45%, meh at 35%. So basically what we can see, oh, and then 19% for poor. So this indicates right now that, let me see, what is 20, 55? 54% of page loads we're coming in at 2.5 seconds or more, but under 4, or maybe more than 4, in fact. So again, we like to look at this kind of data to start to make assessments on the changes that need to happen. Now, again, we'll talk about the LCP here by image by format. Okay, what is the LCP loading? Well, most of the time it's the JPEG, which tends to be along what historically has happened online, which is the JPEG being a popular format. The PNG at 26%, WebP at 4%, and the GIF2 and SVG1. Again, this kind of data is going to come back later as I talk about some of the other audits that we do. I often mention that performance and looking at performance and checking it out is like investigative work. It can be pretty boring, but once you understand what's going on, once you know how to read a waterfall, you can start to predict what's happening and where to make some of the changes. I kind of compare it to a crime scene sometimes. You might see a firearm on the ground, a knife over there, blood spatter on the wall, and you have to figure out what just happened. And that's what it's like when you sort of do some performance auditing. Now, something that most of you probably are familiar with, but if not, we'll talk about it, lazy loading of images, which is actually a bit of a challenge, because once upon a time, it's like, okay, we couldn't really do it natively in the browser, and there were a couple libraries out there that were helping out, but now that it's actually pretty commonplace and supported by all browsers, we should have some pretty good numbers. So now in 2021, on desktop, only 18%, and on mobile, were being lazy loaded, the images. Now, in 2022, we had slightly better numbers, but it's still not where it could potentially be. Now, well, I'll talk about it after. With 2024, we're going to release some of the data through the Almanac. But again, these are the things that you want to keep in mind, and when you see improvements that can be made, you're like, well, you know what? Why aren't we lazy loading X, Y, and Z? Because it's native to the browser. And, another thing that the platform supports is preloading. That's been around for quite a while, actually. But the data shows that, LCP preloading is only being done at this rate, which is literally 1 every 200, so under 1%. And we like to recommend preloading because it's kind of like a cheat code, right? With the LCP being the image that should be prioritized, is the first image that people see and say, oh, there's something happening. Well, we want to make sure it loads as quickly as possible. That's why preloading is possible. And in 2022, this was the rate at which the LCP was being loaded. Again, not amazing numbers, but these are the numbers that we want you to see so that you understand what to do when it comes to looking at the data during an audit. Now, I've just spent a bit of time talking about some of these numbers, but this was all lab data. All synthetic data is what we also call it, all right? And there are parts that are actually missing, and I'm going to talk about that right now. Now, I'm going to bring back Caitlin Tui because she's so awesome. She's a runner, and I'm a runner too. I think I mentioned that earlier. Now, I'll quickly say that I train, believe it or not. When I go on my training runs, I might run 12K, no big deal. Then I might hit the track and do these 800-meter repeats. Any runners here, by the way? I should ask. All right, so you understand this language, yeah? Amazing. So I'll do these 800-meter repeats, like a couple turns around the track. Then I'll have my long run, which I absolutely love. And then, believe it or not, I race. I'm a 5K runner, by the way. So racing is pretty tough. And, when you start racing, the gun goes off, and you see all these other runners around you, and you're like, man, I just want to get some room and get going. But it's almost like a TCP slow start because you're trying to make your way around the crowd. And then at some point, you might, during the race, run into some elevation. And hitting a hill absolutely sucks when you're running. It feels like going from like 4G or some LTE down to 3G because things just kind of slow down. And then at some point, you hit some turns. You have to run around some people and you slow down. It feels like a drop packet. And then there's weather. And we know that sucks. Headwinds aren't good. It's just like not a great experience. But these are things that you never really expect. So training ultimately and racing are completely different things. Training, perfect elements mostly. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to hit my times. But the race, totally different because suddenly I have a bunch of people around me. I didn't know about the weather. I didn't know about that hill. So ultimately what I'm saying is running or training could be like synthetic lab data, perfect elements. But RUM data, which we're going to talk about, real user monitoring, is the field data, but also the race that I was just talking about. So let's talk about what we call real user monitoring, or sometimes you'll hear real user measurements. But ultimately, it's about RUM data. Now, around 2003, Yahoo had this sort of performance team. It was being led, I believe, by Steve Souders, engineer who's retired now, but he had written a couple books that people really regarded well. And performance books, by the way. And they had this library called Roundtrip. And that led to this other open source one called Boomerang, which you could actually use yourself. But what they were not, or what they were RUM data libraries, And one challenge right now is that people are very familiar with this right here, which is Lighthouse. Hands up if you're familiar with Lighthouse. You've used it. Amazing. Lighthouse is a great tool, but it is synthetic. It is lab data. And here's a quote by an engineer at Google. His name's Philip Walton. And he said that getting 100 on Lighthouse score is definitely a very good sign, but it doesn't guarantee that your site will totally be free of any performance issues in the real world. And again, I want to highlight the fact that he said in the real world because we're going to talk about that right now because things can be completely different. Another fantastic quote here, which is, you might build for a particular audience only to discover that the audience you get is also particular. Really, really good quote. Because it's mine. And I got a good story about that in a hot second. Now, who's familiar with this sort of acronym right here, BRIC? Show of hands, which is totally cool if you're not. Stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. All right, because, pardon me? Yeah, definitely. And sometimes you'll see an S, they'll add it, South Africa. Now, I'm going to talk about this in a hot second because I have a story here from this conference that's no longer around called Velocity. It was a performance conference. And I had a client come up, and she gave me this following story. So they'd built this education platform they're really excited about. Everything was fine, testing, et cetera, and they deployed it. And she came up to me, and she's like, they got a lot of messages saying like things were not working right. And, to her surprise, and this was in America, by the way, to her surprise, some students in India had gotten a hold of, I guess, the platform and whatnot, nothing that they expected, and they were not able to load the curriculum and all these things properly on their network. And people were complaining about that. And she came to see us because we had done a presentation, and everything we talked about completely resonated with her. And she came to tell us because she was shocked at what had happened and was basically agreeing with everything we had talked about in terms of what people need to do. And again, I'll bring this back. You might build for a particular audience only to discover that the audience you get is also particular. Now, I've been looking at some RUM data through this open source data set called the RUM archive. And I'm going to share some of the numbers from that data set. So I was looking at page load times by country, G7 countries, something that we're pretty familiar with, I'd say. So we have the 7 countries there, and we see how at P75, by the way, how the page load times more or less vary, but you know, there's a story there. If I add the BRIC countries, we see exactly what's happening. Now, there might be a particular story there as well, but for the most part, we know that things are either like all right, if not pretty poor. We see what's happening in India. China, I'm not sure what happened, but it could be a bunch of, you know, they have a particular network that they, you know, sort of manage themselves. Great story about how to access the Chinese market, by the way. Come ask me about that after. But these are important details. And one of the things that I want to remind people that, again, we are officially in 2024 in a mobile, more or less, first world. I'm going to share some data about that again, some RUM data. And, you know, I like to say that we have 2 users. We have iPhone users, and we have clowns. And, you know, there's a story behind that as well. But I was looking at RUM data more recently again, just what is actually happening in the world. And we were seeing over 2,000 distinct Android models. And I was actually blown away. I'll be honest, I'm an iPhone user, no big deal. But here are some models I've never heard of that they're showing up on the network. Okay, there's a very good chance that you don't know that these models are showing up on the network, you know, supporting your deployments as well. And one of the top 10 devices that I remember seeing was this one right here, which was released in 2012. This is like a few weeks ago. And the specs on this device are not hot, but it's showing up on the network. And these are things that you want to remember. So again, RUM data, what the real users are telling us out there. We're seeing in particular cases where it may peak at 64% iPhone, or I mean mobile devices, and 30% desktop. These are the real numbers that we're seeing out there. So these are the things that I try to get people to keep in mind when they're looking to deploy. Now, I talked about e-commerce earlier. I mean, you'll see that a lot of companies, this is the P1 for them at all times. Last year, there was a blog post talking about Thanksgiving in 2023, and an engineer had basically sort of like looked up some data and wanted to see what was happening in and around Thanksgiving and the Black Fridays or whatever they're called. And you can see that this is the entire month of November. The middle row is mobile devices, and the darkest patches are when they're being used. And you can see that mobile is numero uno over the desktop and over the tablet. So again, these are the kind of data points that we like to get people to remember that they're really dealing with mobile almost all the time. Shopify, speaking of e-commerce, this is from they have a performance team, by the way. They started about a year and a half ago, maybe two. They're talking about real user insights. Essentially, they're talking about RUM. And they're saying, this is what we are providing their merchants at all times, so that they understand what's going on with their sites. Goodbye scores, hello real users. Some people have, reservations about Lighthouse scores and whatever scores. I don't so much, but as long as you understand that a score gives you a particular reading, having real user data also gives you reading, and you need to use both. Who has heard of rage clicks here? Okay, awesome. These are real things that are happening. Users who are frustrated with a particular page that's not loading, a particular site that's not loading well, buttons that are jumping around a page, all right? They start to tap the screen. We're able to log that information right now. And when that comes back, you have to wonder, it's like, hey, what's going on? Because we have some rage clicking on this page, boom, Jira ticket. Now, obviously, third parties, a challenge at times, all right? But we can also, and yes, I called it a UX malaise, but we can also see what's going on. We could pull the data like which parties are being used the most or being downloaded the most, all right? This is a screenshot from the Run archive. I'll share a link as to where you can see that. But, we can see a bunch of GTMs, of course, Facebook, of course, all right? But following that, you can then pull like, okay, well, what if I was looking at my G7s and seeing like how these third parties are loading in these geos? Again, very precise details there, but these are the things that you want to know when you're doing an audit. So if you can make some improvements yourself. We good? All right. I got to help my man out. And you can make some changes. So here we can see what's going on in the US, Japan, India, in terms of load times, just for that one third party. All right. So real quickly, obviously I'm in North Carolina, and I went to Panthers.com. Not because they're a great team, but I just want, someone knows, but I just want to look at the site. And what I did then, and I threw it into web page test, to look at some data on page loads. Now, top row, synthetic data, boom, lab data. I can see what's going on. Large contentful paint, not the best. Total blocking time, okay, also not the best. Means there's probably a bit of excess JavaScript and some other details. However, the real user data is telling me that, the users are kind of doing all right. Well, I can maybe predict like, okay, they're probably in and around the stadium, right? People from, the city and or the state checking to see what's going on. They're on decent, connections, probably on higher end phones. So there's some room for improvement here on the real user side. But the lab data says like it's a bit more of an emergency. Now, you can strike a balance and be like, okay, you know what? I don't think I'm going to get a Cincinnati Bengals fan looking at the Panthers site, but I may make some edits to make sure that at least my user base is doing all right. So, ultimately, what I want to say is, as much as we use Lighthouse quite often, we're very comfortable with Lighthouse scores, etc. And in fact, Lighthouse never started as a performance kind of tool. It was like a PWA checker. But after the performance score came in, people just, it became synonymous with performance scoring, all right? But you have to go beyond the lab. you have to go into the field. You have to look at RUM data so that you can see where exactly your users come from, where they are in terms of like your page and the experience that they're having, and potentially see other details that might be of interest to you. So that being said, I just want to share some QR codes here. So I pulled out some data from the HTTP archive. If you're not familiar with it, by all means, please scan that right there. You'll be able to have, like, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Tons of reading. It's actually super fun. And you can see, again, how the internet is being built. This is also the RUM archive, which you'll be able to pretty much do the same. Not as well detailed so far, because this is fairly new. The HTTP archive has been around for quite a while now. The RUM archive is turning 2, I think, in November, but really fascinating. All right, so it's something I definitely recommend that you check out. I did pull some information from the Web Almanac. Like I said, it's something that's been coming out annually since 2020. They skipped 1 year, and we're actually going to launch this week, Friday. But I urge you to go check that out, and you'll see, again, more fascinating data, stuff that you may have known quite often enough, you know, eye-opening. Oh, you know what? That slide did not belong there. Okay. RUM archive, things that you could pick up, again, a lot of data, LCP, round-trip times, rage clicks, like I mentioned. You know, countries, navigation types, and again, so forth and so on. Protocols, you can see if people are loading your sites on HTTP 1.1 or is it H3. Last thing I want to mention is, in terms of RUM providers, I just realized there's a bunch that are here. You know, SolarWinds. I used to work for a company that was sort of competing with them. I had never seen them in person. Honeycomb's downstairs, Datadog apparently is here, Splunk, New Relic, they all do real user monitoring. In terms of lab providers, honestly, Lighthouse, still a great tool. Web page test, fantastic tool, but again, you have to remember that they are just lab tooling. Now, if you ever want to get in touch, talk about this more, I kind of rushed through it, but I'm happy to go into more details. Shockingly, I do have a LinkedIn. I only joined about 2 years ago. I'm still on Twitter, and I have done some migration to Mastodon, Blue Sky, and I am on Instagram under all the same things. Now, the last thing I want to say is, again, the reminder, there are 2 users. Happy ones who have an amazing experience, and the ones who cannot get Swift tickets. All right? And I just want to make sure that whatever you do during this election, just make sure that you check your site for performance. So, that being said, I want to thank everyone for your time. And if I have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. If not, we can kick it outside. Thank you.